Hey Space Cadets, my name is British Ben, and in this episode of Generation Films, we're not just talking about Starfleet, but its real-life equivalent, the Space Force.
We are going to have the Space Force.
A lot of people have pointed out how the Space Force borrows a lot of its symbols from Star Trek, even to the point of saying that the American military infringes upon intellectual property rights. But we're not here to talk about who owns what. We're here to talk about what the Space Force needs to do to become Starfleet Command. And no, I'm not just talking about the little things like ditching the moon camouflage for colorful uniforms, just not red. Getting better in combat, look how skilled Starfleet are at defeating aliens. Or always having a ship called the Enterprise in the fleet. NASA did actually have that, so I guess the Space Force probably will too. Going back to the uniforms, the Space Force does actually have cool individually designed badges for each department, such as this one for the Space Superiority Systems Directorate, or this one for the Space Test Program. In Star Trek the original series, they were actually originally going to have different badges for different ships and each department, but it was eventually ditched because of budget constraints. But it wasn't like creativity was stifled in Star Trek just because you couldn't wear a patch with Oscar the Grouch riding a satellite in low Earth orbit. And there are a lot of things that Starfleet did in the fictional universe that the Space Force can learn from to become a truly superior space fighting force. So this is 5 things the Space Force must do to become Starfleet Command. Number 1. Reopen Naval Air Station Alameda. Let's start with the basics. Starfleet is headquartered in San Francisco, except for that one time that Franz Joseph put the Starfleet headquarters in Earth orbit. We won't talk about that, it's not canon anyway. Moving on, San Francisco appears in almost every Star Trek series except for the original series and the animated series, and it has a special place in every Trekkie's heart. So why is the Space Force headquartered in Colorado Springs? Well, that's where the Air Force Academy is, so it's kind of convenient, I guess. But let's look at why they cannot choose the Alameda base as their headquarters. So back in the 1990s, when the Cold War ended and the US reorganized its military, there were several naval stations that closed. One of those bases was the Naval Air Station Alameda in the heart of San Francisco. If that name sounds familiar to you, it should, because that's the base that Uhura and Chekhov were looking for in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home.
Can you direct me to the naval base in Alameda? It's where they keep the nuclear vessels.
Nuclear vessels, indeed, one of which was the USS Enterprise CVN-65 aircraft carrier. So Alameda was one of the bases that closed, but in theory it could be reopened if the cities of Alameda and San Francisco came to an agreement with the Space Force and Department of Defense. Next step after that would be number 2, Space Force Academy. Now that we're on the topic of San Francisco, we should address something that Starfleet has and Space Force needs: an academy, where students can learn to beat the shit out of alien life forms.
Welcome to Earth.
So in San Francisco, Starfleet not only has its headquarters, but also Starfleet Academy. Right now, the Space Force does not have an academy of its own, but it's piggybacking off of the Air Force Academy, also in Colorado Springs, to fill its officer positions. And if Space Force really wants to become Starfleet, like all the iconography shows, then they're going to need an academy. And where else better to put it than at the old naval station in Alameda, San Francisco. Just remember to put the dorm for all the cute green alien girls on the other side of the San Francisco Bay, perhaps. Number 3, purging. Space Force is made up of a number of different units from the Air Force Space Command, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. Here at Generation Films, we love diversity, but the Space Force came with a great deal of baggage. Everything from giving in to tech companies trying to keep their over-budget projects alive, to contractors not training their subordinates in fear of losing their jobs. But when we look at Starfleet, we rarely see problems like that. We might have to deal with the occasional quirky crew member that wants to be on the holodeck all day.
We had a meeting at 0700.
Thank you, Professor. End program.
Or the fact that everyone above the rank of captain is a complete psychopath.
Admiral Marcus, you're under arrest.
You're not actually gonna do this, are you?
Or the fact that there's a rogue intelligence agency that operates outside of Starfleet's usual morals.
You want me to spy on an ally?
To evaluate an ally. And a temporary ally at that.
So actually Starfleet's pretty crazy too, but they usually catch those traitors in the end and everything works out all right. What is needed is a good purge. Now, not on the level of Stalin or Mao, mind you. but just a kind of shakedown from the top to the bottom, like a starship getting a new captain, for example, or your favorite restaurant getting a new manager. Just remember to check their resume before hiring, or you might end up with Michael Scott running the entire operation. Number 4. Merge with NASA. Now you might think that the Space Force and NASA have little in common. One is military, one is civilian, but that's actually not the case, and they do have portions of their missions that overlap. While there are Space Force personnel assigned to NASA to coordinate between the two organizations, NASA is a civilian agency whose mission it is to expand frontiers in air and space, to inspire and serve America, and to benefit the quality of life on Earth. Which isn't that far from
to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before.
So it wouldn't be that far-fetched for NASA to put its civilian scientific personnel on Space Force vessels. We do know that Starfleet did have its own fleet of scientific ships, such as the USS Grissom, specializing in science experiments and first contact. We see that one in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. That doesn't always happen. Moving on. By the 24th century, Starfleet had done away with those specialized ships in favor of more generalized vessels, and began allowing families to move on board. By Star Trek The Next Generation, it wasn't unheard of for children to grow up on the same ship as their parents, doing everything from going to school to taking holidays on the holodeck. And this was sometimes awkward for senior officers who just wanted to do grown-up things.
Can we see the battle bridge?
No, I'm afraid not.
Both the Space Force and NASA have the ability and do often perform their own launches with their own crews. But the Space Force use NASA tracking facilities to monitor and track their satellites, and they do sometimes coordinate on launches as well. And bonus fact, a part of the Space Force's mission is to curate a list of all proposed space experiments by tech companies, colleges, universities, and even high school students, many of which end up on NASA or Space Force funded satellites or in orbit on the International Space Station. So it would only make sense to merge the two departments, seeing as their missions are so similar, just like what we see in Star Trek, the military wing merged with the civilian operation to form one cohesive whole. One major benefit would be removing many of the repetitive departments found in both organizations, and NASA could finally update many of its policies, especially the ones surrounding small, micro, and pico satellites. Many regulations in place at NASA were written in the 1960s and 70s, back when satellites were the size of a motorhome. But as technology has progressed and satellites have gotten smaller, NASA has not caught up with the times. It's not uncommon for NASA to require parts on their certification list that can't be feasibly added to these tiny satellites, which then requires additional waiver applications that halt, if not completely derail, a launch schedule. Number 5. Declassify warp drive. Back in 2016, a NASA scientist, Harold G. White, designed a warp-capable ship that blew up on the internet, calling it the Interstellar Experimental Starship, or IXS Enterprise. The design shared a lot in common with the pre-Warp 5 Enterprise seen in the background in some of the scenes in Star Trek The Motion Picture, and also as a model in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies. Additionally, it is supposed to run on the White-Jude Warp Field Interferometer, an experiment designed by NASA to prove faster-than-light travel is possible. And this brings up a good question.
How do you get funding for something like this? You don't actually think they spend $20,000 on a hammer, $30,000 on a toilet seat, do you?
Where are all our taxes going? The Space Force show on Netflix leads you to believe that they're just using conventional rockets. But if you're really going to become Starfleet, you need to declassify the high-tech alien stuff. If a pig farmer can do it, then I'm sure the US military has warp drive too. There's even a military operation going on now called Operation Warp Speed. Are they trolling us? Oh, hold on a second. Yeah. Oh. So I'm being told by the writer of this episode, who was an acquisitions officer in Space Command, that they're still using conventional rockets, and the reason that hammers and toilet seats are so expensive is because of the extremely specific requirements that the Space Force sets for them. But that doesn't mean that the US military isn't working on warp-capable ships, and if the White-Jude Warp Field Interformulator, whatever it's called, is successful, then maybe we can finally get revenge on Cardassia for all they've put us through over these years.
For Scott to call me and say, you should buy her a pair of shoes. I don't need a pair of shoes in the game. I can buy my own shoes. And I'm like, buy her a
pair of shoes, all the I've done for her?
That might be the wrong clip. But anyway, that's all we've got time for today. But guys, do you want to support the Space Force? Do you want to show your loyalty to humanity in our endless battle against alien scum? If so, why not pick up one of our new Space Force Academy t-shirts featuring US patriots trampling on the skulls of those pesky alien savages, and prove once and for all that you're not a traitor to humanity. Available in many styles and colors in our store below. All right guys, thank you so much for watching this episode. Please subscribe if you're new, leave your comments below, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.